Hello guys, and welcome to a new Wargame video today by me, Vulcan. Today I am doing the tutorial for the NATO side on the support units, and today I will be starting with the AML-60. Now this is the first of many artillery pieces on the NATO side, but this is a mortar carrier. Basically a mortar carrier, super fast vehicle with a small mortar on the top. So you can see this turret just here has a little mortar. And it has only a range of 2,625 meters and an accuracy of 3, but a HE power of 6, which isn't too bad for a mortar and can be very effective for dealing with infantry in open ground. Also, when it comes to tanks and other armoured vehicles, it can actually stun them as well, although not being as effective at dealing damage. Now the thing I really like about the AML-60, really fast, 90 km/h speed. It's small, so it's hard to hit, and it has a strength of 10, which is actually quite good for a light armoured vehicle like it. And the road speed of 150 km/h is very fast as well, doesn't run out of fuel very often, and has plenty of ammo, 35 rounds, to deal enough damage to those pesky infantry units in forests and open ground. You've also got the upgraded version, the AML-6020 Serval. This comes with a slightly better mortar, a 60mm mortar, the same as before, except from it has 4,200 meter range, which is almost double, which is really nice. And we've got only 25 rounds though, that's something you have to worry about. And they do come with autocannons, which can be useful for taking out pesky light units. But the trouble is, if you bump into any APCs that cost 30 points, normally they're going to have better armaments than this. So I would never recommend using the autocannon to directly attack enemy units. I would definitely keep this as a mortar carrier purely. Now the heat rounds, the 60mm heat rounds, aren't very useful purely because they don't deal that much damage. They only have an AP power of 4, which again is useful for like APCs with machine guns, and that's really what these are good for clearing up, but not anything with anything heavier like a main gun or an autocannon itself, because these will probably die first. They only have 1 all-round armor, but that will keep them alive from enemy counter artillery, which is something you have to think about a lot when taking artillery units. So now we're moving on to the AMX-13 AuF1 105mm. This is a reasonably nice vehicle, not my favourite choice, but the really good thing about this particular artillery unit is you're upgrading from a mortar to an actual artillery cannon, and it costs the same as the AML-6020 Serval. Now, because of that, it has an accuracy of 4 instead of an accuracy of 3, and it has a HE power of 8 instead of a HE power of 6. But this is a pure purpose artillery vehicle. It has a range of 1,400 meters. For this kind of vehicle, it's really nice. It keeps it at a distance that is safe, and because it's an artillery only unit, it's reasonably decent for its price and can be very effective. Now, it has a strength of 10. Not the fastest vehicle with 60 km/h, but pretty fast for a self-sustaining artillery piece. But the road speed is not as fast as the AMLs. We've got a fuel capacity and autonomy of 1,000 litres and 500 kilometres. That is very good because it means that you can move them around the map and keep them just behind your front line, and they will probably not run out of fuel for the entire game, so you won't have to worry about that too much. But an all-round good artillery piece. You've got to be careful with that topside armour. If they get hit by anything like helicopters, they will die more or less instantly because they don't have any top armour. And the front armour is actually quite good at deflecting nearby blows, but if it gets hit directly, it will just die. Now we've got the AMX-AuF1. This is a pretty beastly artillery piece with 150mm rounds, in which it has 36 of. It has a range to ground of 23,000 meters or 24,000 meters rounded up, and we've got an accuracy of 6. Now an accuracy of 6 is much better than an accuracy of 4, And then we've got the HE power of 10, which is very, very powerful as well. Now, most artillery units only have around 10 HE power max, except from the howitzers. And basically that means that this is pretty much as good as you're going to get in most cases if you want to be firing off salvos of artillery shells rather than just the 1 or 2 that the howitzers can fire. It has a suppression value of 357, which is really good at suppressing heavy tanks, very good at doing morale damage rather than specifically doing damage to the tanks themselves. It normally panics those sort of tanks, but what the AMX AuF1 is really good for is pounding light armor, light and medium armor, probably medium armor max, and then it just instantly destroys any infantry that it lands by. We've got the rate of fire of 7 rounds per minute, which isn't too shabby at all. But the good thing about the AMX AuF1 is it can use its actual cannon to defend itself. So it can load AP shells if it comes across any APCs which have managed to sneak through to your base. So you can use the accuracy of 3 and the HE power of 14 if they get close enough to really deal quite significant damage. And that can be really useful. Also, with the armor of 3 on the front and 2 on the side, it definitely stays alive for a reasonable amount of time, and the strength of 10 is useful as well. Furthermore, it also has a 60 km/h speed that the AMX-13 AU has, which is good for an artillery piece of its size. And then we've also got the M2 Browning machine gun, which can suppress infantry. So it pretty much is a self-defensive artillery weapon. The only thing you have to be worried about is the price, for starters. It's very expensive, and I believe you only get 1 or 2 if you bring them in on your deck, so you're not going to be having too many of them, which can be an issue. Whereas the AMX-13 AU, you can get a lot more, but they'll deal significantly less damage in a concentrated area. Now we're moving on to one of the first AA weapons in the game. We got the AMX-13 OEIL Noir, and this basically comes with a quad autocannon of 30mm, and it has 600 rounds. The range versus ground is 1050 meters, range versus helicopters and aeroplanes of 2275 meters. Now the accuracy of 6 is decent, HE power of 1, suppression of 69. Now basically it's a radar weapon which can be extremely good at baiting out ravens. Now, for those of you who aren't too familiar with the planes in Wargame Airland Battle, you can get radar weapons or seed missiles, which are basically anti-radar missiles. And if you have a bunch of these on your deck and you place them in front of your actual missile radar weapons, then what will happen is when a enemy player brings in a radar anti-radar seed aircraft, they will shoot at these before they shoot at your missile units, which may be worth significantly more. So definitely something to think about if you're going to bring them onto your deck. The good thing about these though, optics are exceptional. That is against air units and not ground units, so don't use them as recon, that's just silly. Strength of 10, they are well armoured, so they have the 2 front armour, they won't get RT'd that easily, and they have a 60 km/h speed to match the AMX-13 and the AMX AuF1. So these are reasonably good and very, very cheap support units. Now we've got the AMX-30 Roland. We're going to the more sophisticated system now. This is the Roland 1 system. This is like the first Roland system, which comes with 10 SACLOS missiles with a range versus helicopters of 2,800 and a range versus airplanes of 2,275. We then got an accuracy of 10, which is really, really decent for basically shooting down at extremely long ranges. So that basically means it's got a 50% hit chance and max range. Now these fire off in salvos of 2, and basically they take a little while to reload. So basically you can kind of rely on every one of the 2 missiles that they fire in at once to hit. Depending on how close you are, they may both hit. But the suppression of 200 is decent, and the rate of fire of 10 rounds per minute is not actually too bad. Also, the good thing about the Rolands, they're well armoured, 3 front armour, 2 side armour, 2 rear armour, which means they're not going to be taken out by artillery very easily. They have 60 km/h speed and a 110 km/h road speed. They also have a decent fuel capacity of 1,000 litres and autonomy of 600 km/h, so they're never really going to run out of fuel unless you're moving them around a lot. Now, a trick with Rolands specifically is to take them in groups of 2. Now, the reason people do this is purely because of their accuracy. If one of every 2 missiles is firing and then they have to completely reload before they hit another plane, then why don't you take 2? Because then you guarantee that at least 2 missiles will hit. They both have an HE power of 5, and they will be able to basically one-shot as a 2-man squad any helicopter or airplane that comes into range. So keep them in squads of 2. That goes for all Roland systems. So you can see we've got the Roland 2 here, which is basically increased by having much better range versus airplanes and much better accuracy. Now, I must stress that the original Roland uses SACLOS missiles and the Roland 2 uses radar missiles. That's the big difference. SACLOS missiles can't be targeted by the anti-radar seed missiles, whereas the Roland 2 system, which uses the radar missiles, can. So that's something you have to worry about, but it compensates by having a 3,500 meter range versus airplanes and the accuracy of 13. Now, nothing else changes except from the AMX-13 Roland 2 is a prototype for the French, and only the French decks can get them. So you've got to worry about that. They have exceptional optics over very good optics, but the rest stays the same. So moving on to the Bandkanon 1A. This is an extremely effective Swedish artillery vehicle. It has a 150mm round cannon, which is the same as the AMX AuF1, but it costs a nice 15 points less. Now, admittedly, it does have less accuracy, but more range. It also has an MG that can cover it, like the AMX AuF1, but the big issue here is that the Bandkanon 1A doesn't have the ability to fire AP shells out of its main cannon, which leaves it vulnerable to attack from any light armoured vehicles, because a machine gun's going to do nothing and you're not going to be able to fire artillery at close range, whereas the AMX AuF1 can basically load in some kinetic rounds and do a ton of damage. Now, also a big issue with this particular thing is that it goes 30 km/h off-road. God awful. Really, really good for getting them into position and then leaving them there, but you can't hide it at all. Size of big, well, you can hide it, but it's going to be pretty difficult and very, very slow. And it's got a road speed of 110 km/h, which is what you want to do. You want to keep it nearby roads all the time, otherwise it's never going to be able to run away from anything it comes across because it can't defend itself. And also, because it's Swedish, you've got a really, really limited fuel tank, a fuel capacity of 1,500 litres, an autonomy of 230 kilometres, which if you move it around too much, will become very apparent. So always think about how far you're moving this thing. Most of the time you can actually afford to keep these by your FOB at base most of the game. Just be sure to keep them well defended. So let's move on to the mortars of the British. We've got the FV432 mortar carrier. This comes with the L16 A2 mortar, 81mm mortar this is, so it's not the same as the AMX-60, which comes with a 60mm mortar. It's got an 80mm mortar, which is shown by the fact that it has 7 HE power. It's not very accurate with an accuracy of 3, but its range versus ground is quite large for a mortar unit of 4,900 meters, which is nice for helping support attacks into towns. We've also got a machine gun, which can come in handy for dealing with any pesky infantry that comes and finds your mortars, but it's not going to deal a great amount of damage with that accuracy of 4 and a rate of fire of 600 rounds per minute, which is pretty god-awful. And then we've only got an armour of 1, a side armour of 1, and a rear armour of 1, and no top armour, so direct hits will basically kill it from enemy counter-artillery, from stuff like mortars. So enemy mortar fire will kill these units very, very quickly if they get direct hits, which is more than likely because mortar units, although they have a lower accuracy, because they have a shorter range, it's not so much of a big deal because they still fire a corrected shot in a very small area. We've also got a size of medium. It will get spotted reasonably easy, and the autonomy isn't great because it's 480 kilometers. If you move it around too much throughout the game, you might need to refuel it. So moving on to the FV433 Abbot, probably one of my more favoured British artillery pieces, purely because I really like its ability to support at close ranges. It has an HE power of 8, which is actually quite high, and an accuracy of 5, which is really good for its price tag. Now if we compare it to the AMX-13, it comes into a similar sort of role. So if we compare it, you can see that you're paying 10 extra points to gain a cannon that can fire versus or long range with artillery, or kinetic rounds versus close threatening units like APCs and tanks. Then we've also got the fact that it's a little bit smaller, being medium size, but it is slower and will suffer from the autonomy of 480 kilometers if you're moving it around with your front line. Furthermore, you also get an extra range with the Abbot and extra accuracy, which I always like to pay for. Now, Abbots, keep them in like squads of 2 and make sure you don't forget about them. That's something I'm really bad at with artillery. I like to forget it. And to be honest, not a good idea because you're wasting quite a lot of points if you don't. And well, I like to keep them just behind my front lines. Now, 16,000 or 17,000 meters is a long way, and you never need to use them at max range. I think that's a complete waste of the shells that they have. They only have 40 rounds of 105mm, and I think it's definitely best to use them within 10,000 meters. So anything further than that I think is a massive waste because they aren't as effective as the seriously high HE power weapons like the M110 AA, which is the first howitzer. Now this comes with a 203mm cannon, but it only has 2 rounds. It fires at a rate of 1 per minute. Okay, and basically the way this works is you select it, you click fire position on the map, the howitzer fires a pinpoint accurate howitzer shell at the point that you put it at, and then it reloads, and then you can fire another one. You want to keep these resupplied as best you can, but they do use up a ton of resources. They have an accuracy of 9 and a not great range of 16 or 17,000 meters isn't amazing, but with a HE power of 14 and a suppression value of 467, it makes a pretty big bang when it hits the ground and can do serious damage to more heavily armed or armored units, which it is incredible when you think about it. And then we've got the M110 A2 AA, which comes with a slightly upgraded cannon with a little bit extra range. We've got 24,000 meter range, and we've got an accuracy of 10, so we're going up by 1 here, but this HE power is the same. Now the first version, the M110, does have a better fuel capacity and autonomy than the M110 A2, but hopefully you're not going to have to move these around too much, and just basically use them to take out specific units like a AA unit that's maybe in the way, so you just pinpoint accurate with the howitzer shot, and it should basically just one shot that one target. That's what these are extremely useful for. So now we've got the FV434 Falcon. Now, just so you guys know, this is a prototype unit, can only be used on British decks. It has the same hull as the Abbot, except from it comes with a twin autocannon, which are 30mm, and they have a range versus ground versus 1,050 meters, range versus helicopters of 2,100 meters, and a range versus airplanes of 1,750 meters. An accuracy of 8, which is actually reasonably good, 40% hit chance, and the rate of fire of 263 rounds per minute is actually quite significant when it gets close to enemy helicopters or airplanes. Now, I must stress that this isn't the best unit to use against airplanes in any way, but it can come in handy. But it's more a really good unit to use against helicopters. And it's not, it may be a prototype unit, but I think it's just added to the British to give them a bit more variance, because they do lack a lot of AA units when you build British specific decks. Thankfully, in the latest DLC they have added extra units, and I am just going to be adding them in as I go along. I'm not going to be necessarily stating that they have been added in a DLC. If anything is added in a DLC after I've created all of these videos, I'll do a separate video adding those units to my tutorials. But yeah, this particular unit, 2 front armor, 1 side armor, 1 rear armor, and has very good optics for taking care of helicopters, so can come in very handy and is decent for supporting ground troops like infantry when they're pushing up into towns. And the reason for this is the speed. The speed is 445 kilometers per hour, which is significantly low compared to what it actually needs to be in order to support heavier troops, so that's why I'm saying it's good for infantry. So now we've got the nice 15-point Flakpanzer M42 AA. This is a 40mm round dual autocannon which can fire into the sky at a range of 1,925 meters versus helicopters and 1,575 meters versus airplanes. Extremely effective against ground targets though. An accuracy of 4 and a HE power of 1, which is extremely good against ground targets because it has the same range against ground of 1,050 meters, but it comes at a price of 15 points. It has a speed of 65 kilometers per hour, which is extremely good, and with any autocannon they can be useful to rip apart tanks at close range, which is something that I haven't necessarily tried with this unit, but in theory should work. So if you had a bunch of these moving through a forest, I suspect you'd be able to take out a significant amount of units, unless you bumped into numerous amounts of infantry. Now, the biggest thing you have to worry about with these is, yes, they're great and they have lots of power in their autocannons, but they have crap autonomy and crap fuel capacity. You're going to have to keep these resupplied as you go along, otherwise they're just going to run out of fuel and they're going to be stranded all over the map. So be completely wary of that. Now we've got the Flakpanzer Gepard. These are the first of the radar autocannon AA units. We've got 35mm radar rounds on this, which are significantly better than normal autocannons against airplanes and helicopters in terms of range. So you can see that the range versus helicopters and airplanes is 2,800 meters, and it has the same range versus grounds of 1,050 meters. Now the Flakpanzer Gepard has an accuracy of 7, which is a 35% hit chance, with a HE power of 1 and a suppression of 81. The rate of fire of 181 rounds per minute is not as effective as other anti-aircraft units, but basically it's decent enough to take them out if it hits with those accurate shots that it definitely can. Now the optics of exceptional means it's going to spot those pesky helicopters a mile off with its radar, and basically it's a solid all-round unit to leave close to sort out helicopters. Not as reliable against airplanes though, because of seed missiles. Then we've got the Gepard A1, which is basically a prototype upgrade with an extra 2 accuracy, and you can only bring these in on German, West German specific decks. So bear that in mind. But you're basically just paying an extra 10 points for 2 more accuracy, which in my opinion isn't necessarily worth it. Yes, you're going from 35% hit chance to 45% hit chance, but it's one of those things. You can bring in like 3 or 4 Flakpanzer Gepards for like the same price of 3 Flakpanzer Gepard A1s. So I would generally go for 4 over 3. So now we have the first of the NATO rocket artillery units, the LARS. It has the SF2 rocket system with a range versus ground of 17,500 meters. Has a HE power of 6, a suppression value of 127, and a rate of fire of 24 rounds per minute. Now it has 36 110mm rounds, which is really good for stunning infantry, but not necessarily anything armoured. I wouldn't recommend this unit at all, purely because the attack will be so spread that the missiles will actually, or the rockets, sorry, will be really ineffective against anything other than large infantry pushes. And I mean large because the spread of these rockets can be dreadful at extremely long ranges. It's got a size of big, and optics are bad. Speed of 45 kilometers per hour, but the fuel capacity and autonomy will allow it to keep within the range of the enemy throughout the game. Then we've got the LARS 2. The LARS 2 is basically a small upgrade from the original LARS, but the only thing that really changes is the amount of rockets that you fire, which goes from 24 to 32 rounds per minute, and the extra HE power, which is significantly upgraded from 6 to 10, which can be very, very powerful for taking care of large amounts of infantry again. But because it's HE power of 10, it can also be used to focus down units like AA or things with low amounts of armor. So yeah, it can be very useful for basically suppressing a large amount of units, but not as good as other rocket units. So now we've got the M110 AA1 mortar carrier for the Americans. This comes with an 81mm mortar, which has a range versus ground of 4,200 meters, accuracy of 3, which is kind of abysmal, 15% hit chance, although for artillery units it's not necessarily a hit chance, it's more to do with the size of the aiming reticule. Then we have the HE power of 7, which is reasonably high for a mortar unit, a suppression of 187 and a rate of fire of 13 rounds per minute. We've then got the strength of 10, speed of 65 kilometers per hour, very, very mobile mortar carrier. And then we've got the M2 Browning to help it defend itself against enemy infantry attack, although not necessarily going to keep it alive for long with its low armor of 1 front, 1 side and 1 rear. We've also got the other 2 variants. We've got the M106 A2, which basically comes with a better mortar. We've got the 107mm mortar with a range versus ground of 6,300 meters. It has the same accuracy of 3, but a HE power of 8, and a better suppression of 247. So this is ultimate infantry killer, and also can be very useful because mortars have a smaller reticule at closer ranges. They can be useful, this particular mortar carrier, for attacking units of medium tanks, to just stun and suppress them, not necessarily to do any damage at all. Also has the M2 Browning to help out with infantry, and the same speed of 65 kilometers per hour. Now the next is just a change of vehicle. We've got the 81mm mortar from the M110 AA1, but in an LAV with its turret taken off. And the idea of this is it's really, really fast. It can reposition very quickly with its 100 km per hour speed. Other than that, the mortar remains exactly the same as the M110 AA1, but the only thing that changes is the M240 machine gun. And well, this is more favoured to the M110 AA1 normally because of its ability to move around a lot and keep in those close ranges that it needs without being caught out by enemy units. So I would definitely recommend taking the LAV-M over the M110 A1 most of the time. But if you want something a bit heavier for a mortar, then get the M106 A2. Now we've got the LV-KV FM43. This is another dual autocannon unit, similar to the Flakpanzer M42 A1. This is decent, basically supporting ground troops like infantry, but not much else. Now, the big thing you have to worry about with these particular units on the Swedish deck is the autonomy. 150 kilometers autonomy is dreadful. You need to keep them refueled throughout the entire game, and it can be quite annoying, to be honest, because they get stranded in the middle of nowhere like all the time. Accuracy of 3 is kind of god awful for a twin autocannon, but then again, the range versus helicopters 1,925 meters for a 10-point unit is not too shabby, and that's what you got to think about with this particular unit. It's actually quite good for its cost. Twin autocannons are quite expensive normally, and this one costs 10, so you can get away with bringing a few of these in just to support your troops as they push through, and they do have that 1,050 meter range versus ground targets, so definitely something to think about. Then we've got the speed of 55 kilometers per hour, which can let it keep up with some APCs and other units that it may need to keep up with. And then we've got the 110 kilometer per hour road speed. Then we've got the VulcanHDGaming, which is basically an upgraded dual autocannon unit, which goes from having normal AoE rounds to radar rounds. So this is like your Flakpanzer Gepards with the radar AA units, but with autocannons. And you can see it has that extra bonus versus helicopters and airplanes of the 2,800 meter range. Then we got the accuracy of 8 and the suppression value of 92 and the rate of fire of 360 rounds per minute, which is actually double pretty much of the Flakpanzer Gepard, which is definitely a big bonus for these particular units. But the trouble is, they would be really nice to have in your deck if they weren't prototype units. So these are units specific to the Swedish deck, and that's unfortunately something you have to consider when trying to use them. We now have the optics of exceptional, which most radar AA units have versus air and helicopters, not versus ground, so don't use them as recon. And we've got the fuel capacity and autonomy of 500 litres and 600 kilometres, which is decent enough to not need it to be refueled throughout the game. So we're moving on to another Saklos missile system. The RBS-70 comes on a small APC, the LV-RBV-701, and has a range versus helicopters of 2,500 or 450 meters. We got range versus airplanes of 1,960 meters and an accuracy of 9. A HE power of 5, which is really good. Like I was saying with the infantry, you basically need a HE power of 5 to deal with all of the heavier packed helicopters like Mi-8Ts and Mi-24s and all their variants. We've got a rate of fire of 6 rounds per minute. This thing has 12 rockets, which is actually a lot for a unit like this. And it can be very effective versus helicopters. Not so much versus airplanes, because having less than 2,000 meter range is not too significant against airplanes and can't cover enough of the sky in order to actually void airspace. But it does have a decent machine gun to keep itself protected versus infantry, but honestly that should never need to be the case. And then we've got the one front, one side and one rear armor, which can help it survive from artillery pieces, but anything that sneaks through can take it out very easily, because that's not a significant amount of armor in any shape or form. Then we've got the speed of 45 kilometers per hour, which means it's not going to be able to move around or keep up very well with units moving off-road. However, it does have the 110 kilometers per hour road speed, which is useful but will suffer from the autonomy of 250 kilometers. Another Swedish trait coming through. We've got poor fuel usage, which basically means you're going to have to keep them refueled throughout the game, which can, again, get annoying. So that's it for part 1 of the NATO support tutorial. Next time I'll be covering the rest of the artillery AA and mortar units. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this, hopefully you've learned something. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.